LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation, the Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, we were waiting for Theresa May's response to the growing concern over what's happened in Salisbury. And remember yesterday, 500 people who'd been to the Mill pub and to the Ziz's Pizza parlour were told, wash their clothes, wash their jewellery, clean their mobile phones. So I think growing consternation amongst the residents of Salisbury about what's happened, and big anticipation to see what Mrs May's response was going to be today in the House of Commons. Here's just a piece of it.
It is that Mr Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr Speaker, this attempted murder using a weapons-grade nerve agent in a British town was not just a crime against the Skripals. It was an indiscriminate and reckless act against the United Kingdom, putting the lives of innocent civilians at risk. And we will not tolerate such a brazen attempt to murder innocent civilians on our soil.
Well, tough talk there from the Prime Minister. I mean, really very tough talk from the Prime Minister. And, well, she says that, you know, the chemistry is telling us that the Russians have produced this type of nerve agent before, and she's pretty clear. She believes it is linked to the Russians. That, of course, is not quite the same as saying the Russian government sanctioned this. It's possible that a rogue agent did it. I don't know. But, of course, you know, we did see the Litvinenko case 10 years ago. That was using polonium. And we have seen, have we not, the murder, the supposed suicides of a number of people who appear to have crossed the Russian regime, and in particular to have crossed Vladimir Putin. But, as ever with these things, she couldn't absolutely say for certain what it was, and the Russian ambassador who met Boris Johnson earlier today has been given an ultimatum. He's been told to, by 3 o'clock tomorrow, give a proper counter-response, as opposed to the current Russian line, which is that the whole thing's a circus and it's all nonsense. Now, a lot of MPs jumped on this and were speaking very strongly about Putin and Russia, and many of them, you know, have been deeply critical of Russia, and many of them in the Commons over the course of the last year have said that they believe Russia colluded in the Trump election, and some even suggesting that perhaps there was collusion with Brexit too. But there was one voice today in the House of Commons saying, let's just be a little bit careful how we handle this. And I think many of his own backbenchers struck a different tone, but here was Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition.
We need to continue seeking a robust dialogue with Russia on all the issues currently dividing our countries, both domestic and international, rather than simply cutting off contact and letting the tensions and divisions get worse and potentially even more dangerous.
So Corbyn there taking a very different line to the Prime Minister, a very different line to many in the House of Commons, including, it seemed, virtually all of his own back benches. So the PM's been tough. The Leader of the Opposition has said, wait for it, and whatever we do, let's not sort of start this tit-for-tat expulsion of diplomats. Let's keep the dialogue going. What do you think, the LBC listeners and callers, what do you think Mrs May should do next? And if you think you want her tough talk today to actually become action, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Or perhaps you think, actually, do you know what? Jeremy Corbyn is the cool head in this. We don't want to ramp this up. We don't want to escalate this into a major diplomatic incident. Mind you, it's not too far away from that right now. And if you think that's right, and Corbyn's, you know, on the money with this, text to 84850. And maybe you think, actually, she said all she can say. There isn't in reality much more she can do. In which case, tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and watch us on Facebook. We're live here from the European Parliament in Strasbourg. I have to say, that was quite a tough tone for the Prime Minister to take. I've never been one of those who has been a massive conspiracy theorist about Putin and interference in our elections. Far from it. I mean, I've been accused, of course, many times of being his best mate and running memory sticks between the White House, the Kremlin, and Julian Assange, all of which I can tell you is nonsense. Does seem to me, in this case, I'm saying this without evidence, but it does seem to me in this case, it's very unlikely that it wasn't a Russian state actor of some kind, with or without the approval of Putin and the government. That is my view, and I think the Prime Minister has been strong on this today, but I don't personally see actually what more she can do. I don't know. Steve in Rickmansworth maybe will have the answer. Good evening, Steve.
Hi, Nigel. Hi. I don't know whether they did it or not. I really don't know. And the trouble is, I've kind of lost interest in what the government says because they tell so many lies. They just tell so many lies, Nigel. I mean, 22 years ago today, Dunblane happened. There's a 100-year ban on information. 100-year ban on information. Now, that's very strange when you have a 50-year ban on information regarding Second World War secrets, etc., Bletchley Park. And I just feel that, you know, it's probably Putin, but I'm not convinced. I just don't believe everything they tell us. There's been institutional paedophile rings in the Westminster being covered up.
Well, Steve, I'd be a bit cautious about that. I mean, this so-called bloke Nick, who was giving all this evidence, didn't amount to very much, did it? Straw man,
absolute straw man. I know a lot of stuff, Nigel, and I tell you what, you know, I've met a lot of people, and I've met people that have been involved in that, and you know, they haven't done well out of it either. So all I'm saying is, I don't believe everything the government says. Yep. I really don't.
So given that, Steve, you know, she's made a strong statement today, and let's be honest,
very, very strong, very good.
I mean, let's be honest, Steve. What has happened in Salisbury is appalling and irresponsible on an extraordinary scale.
Yes.
I mean, what do you think she ought to say or do next?
I think she's done the right thing. I absolutely do. Just in case it is them. But the trouble is, you know, I've just lost. You know, I mean, faith. You know, I've lost my faith. I've lost faith. I've just lost faith in them. I've read a lot. I'm very well read. You know, there's books out by Michael Shrimpton. You know, called Spy Hunter. You know, it's all on there, mate. It's all on there. And Dunblane. There's books on Dunblane. Everybody knows. A friend of mine was in the court case representing the firearms lobby, and he told me stuff 20 years ago. So I know. Okay,
Steve, do you know what? You know, if you're ringing me to say you don't really believe any, you know, word that she says or anyone says, and you've lost faith in our political class, let me tell you, Steve, from Rickmansworth, you are not on your own. There are many millions who feel as Steve does. Thank you for your call. Richard says on Facebook, Russia is relying on the fact that the UK response will be minimal. Well, Richard, what could it be? You know, we could kick out a few diplomats. We could start to target some of the rich Russians living in London who are associated with the regime, or some of the big businesses in Russia. I mean, there are things we could do, but there isn't really all that much we can do, it seems to me. Dale is a new caller to this show from Weybridge. Good evening, Dale.
Good evening, Nigel.
So what did you make of her speech?
Well, I'm quite amazed that in this country, I thought we had a rule of innocent until proven guilty.
Well, it's a very good point. And isn't that really, Dale, what Corbyn was saying today in a way?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm not a Corbyn fan, but
nor am I, Dale. But I'm just saying he was. Far from it. But you know, he was actually saying, "Whoa, slow down a little bit. You know, let's not make this worse than it needs to be."
Well, I would have liked to hear Corbyn ask the question, which I think is the most obvious question, which is, well, didn't they have CCTV footage? Didn't they have ANPR information on cars that went in and out of that area on that day? Didn't they have information on anybody who they think is a suspect, and why they could monitor the airports, they could monitor the people coming in on passports or whatever it is, whoever their suspects are. Well, shouldn't the job of Theresa May's government, shouldn't she be instructing the police to be investigating this properly and not delaying?
I think we can assume, Dale, that's been done. And the fact they haven't, come up yet with any conclusive CCTV footage maybe indicates that this poison was not administered in that pizzeria or in a pub, that actually it was administered perhaps at their home via a parcel or some other method. The truth is, Dale, we don't know the answers to all of these things, do we?
No, that's correct. I mean, obviously, the way it could be administered could have been in some form of slow release product that they'd eaten earlier. Or
Dale, we just don't know. So what?
No,
so your advice to the Prime Minister would be, don't do any more until we're absolutely certain. Yeah.
Well, I was quite spooked by what she said, and it reminded me of Tony Blair standing up in Parliament and saying that he found weapons of mass destruction, and that we should all be spooked by this. And let's face it, if you were working for Russia, and I'm not saying you, Nigel, I know there's been this long.
It's very kind of you, Dale. A lot of people think I am, but thank you.
But the crazy thing is that if it would take anybody anywhere in the world who would want to do anything, like let's say North Korea, I don't know, but equally it still could be MI6. I mean, it doesn't really matter who it is, but anybody who uses a Russian nerve agent at a time when people are trying to point the finger at Russia.
Dale, it could be anybody. I will not personally accept that we did it to ourselves, because that gets us into the Twin Towers and all the rest of it. Dale, I thank you. Well, 2 callers so far, both of whom are deeply sceptical about anything and everything British politicians tell them. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:15. Strong words today from the Prime Minister, saying it probably was Russia and that this nerve agent is of a type that they've manufactured before. Words of caution and thought from Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition. And I'm asking you, what do you think the Prime Minister should say or do next? And your comments are flooding in. Alison says, I think it's just as likely to be Russia as anyone else, frankly. The reputation of May being a complete pushover is not doing this nation any favours. Well, you could argue, Alison, she wasn't a pushover today. I really hope, although having said that, has she been rushed into this too early? Interesting thought. I really hope she starts showing the same resolve with the European Union that she's been showing with Russia. We can't beat Russia, but we could wipe the floor with the European Union. Interesting. Brexit, of course, never far away from any debate in this country. Linda says, where is your proof, Theresa? Why don't you get help from the UN? Why did your government want war with Russia? Was it self-inflicted by the security services? Write scripts for Midsummer Murders, perhaps. You tell a far-fetched story. The lack of faith in our political leaders is surprising even me. I have to say, the idea this was self-inflicted by the security services, I do not buy into one little bit. Liz says, not sure the best way of dealing with it, but we do have to say something to rogue states. You can't just use a nerve agent in the UK whenever you feel like bumping someone off. What about all the innocent people it affected? I wouldn't be happy if I was in Salisbury that day. No, Liz, and I think normally you get a story, people are scared, and then it kind of eases down over the next few days. I sense in Salisbury a growing level of consternation about what's happened. Davina says the point that I made earlier. Other than the fact that it was made in Russia, there is no proof it was Putin. And that's right, Davina, it could well have been a rogue agent trying to get his own back. Who's to say? And Chris says, what I can't understand is why our British MI5 didn't pick up on this. Well, Chris, they do pick up on an awful lot. I guess they can't pick up on everything. Joe is in Brighton. Good evening, Joe.
Good evening, Nigel. I believe we need to talk to Russia.
Yes.
And we need to reset the relationship. You don't have to look too far to see why Putin is treating the UK like this. If you go on YouTube, you can look up Putin's values about the West, and he talks about we've sold everything out, we have no sense of loyalty, we don't believe in our faith anymore. So he sees us as weak.
Yes.
And he also sees that there's been a major turn towards the east, and that's why you've got that China changing the laws. It's no longer a kind of democratic, non-democratic system, if that makes sense. And basically, he's seen weakness. We've reduced the army. We tend to get involved with conflicts we shouldn't be involved with. I mean, you're dicing with a roulette wheel being on the border of Russia when we know the Russian mentality. I have Russian...
Oh, Joe, look, nobody has been more critical of the Cameron-Osborne policy, supported by virtually everybody in the West, of enlarging the European Union and NATO to include the Ukraine. I mean, absolutely think that was a crazy thing to do, as you say, given the Russian mentality. But, Joe, when Trump in his campaign said, look, I want to meet Putin, I want to talk to Putin, nothing may come of it, but I've got to try. I thought he was absolutely right to say that. But, Joe, and you're making that same point now, but do you think that this former spy, who, of course, is seen by many in Russian circles to be a traitor, do you think the Russian authorities tried to have him bumped off?
As they said, it could be a rogue agent. But can I tell you something? I have customers in Kensington who are Russian. They are very, very loyal to you. If you do any kind of trade service, they will use you. They will introduce you to other people. And they're not this dark horse, what everyone's trying to jump on and trying to shut down people going to Russia today. It's the wrong way, because then you're showing hostility. So that's the other thing they're trying to do now, saying people shouldn't go in Russia today. I
mean, for a lot of the House of Commons, Joe, and absolutely, and that was said in the House of Commons today, for lots of people in our political class, they sort of need to have an enemy. And it's been really useful to them for Putin to be the enemy. I mean, how many times was I told, if we vote Brexit, the only person that'll benefit is Putin. So they need to have this enemy. Joe, I mean, would it be a good idea, given where relations are now, given May's statement, that the next thing she does is she says, I am going to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin. We're going to thrash out this and other issues. Would that be the sensible next thing to do?
That is the sensible course to follow. I mean, without any doubt, I mean, Russia hasn't really interfered with a lot of world politics over the last 40 years until it came to its doorstep. so really, we really have to have peace with Russia. And, at the same time, I would like to say one thing about Brexit, how I see it.
Joe, we're not doing Brexit, but I'll give, as you've said, made some very interesting points. You've got 15 seconds, Joe, to make your point on Brexit.
Why I agree with you is that people don't realise how much damage it's done to Commonwealth countries, what need to develop. And until you develop those countries, you're going to always have people coming trying to get through Calais. You have to find a way to start building up those areas, because Europe is okay, and if Europe is okay and the rest of the world is not okay, you're always going to have a flood of people trying to come in.
Joe, thank you. I'm going to stop you there. And Joe makes that point today, which is Commonwealth Day. Been a big service this afternoon in Westminster Cathedral. I wanted to be there, but my day job, I have to be here in the European Parliament. And it's interesting, isn't it? There I was in Washington, D.C. the other week, and the Royal Commonwealth Society had their first ever event in the USA, and it's an attempt, I think, for the English-speaking peoples of the world, as Churchill called them, to try and come a bit closer together. And many would argue, myself included, that Brexit gives us that possibility. Right, we're not talking Brexit tonight. Let's get back to what Mrs. May ought to do, given the strong words she's made in the House of Commons today. What next? Mick in Brentwood, a new caller to the show. Welcome.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. At last I get to speak to you. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the first bit of calm, reasonable, rational approach that we've had all week to this hysteria that's been going on. And hats off to Jeremy Corbyn, I say, for saying what he said. And I am, Nigel, I have to say I am very pro-Brexit, very much a supporter of you, especially when you got together with George Galloway. You went right up in our house when you did that. And even though I'm a lefty, we'll probably disagree about a million things. But yeah, no, honestly, the Russian hysteria, I've got a quote from Putin the other day, talking to Megyn Kelly from Fox News, and Putin says the following. He says, you're constantly interfering in our political life. And then he says, do you know what the Americans told me? He said, the Americans told Putin, they said, quote, yes, we do interfere, but we're entitled to because we are spreading democracy and you are not. Yeah, exactly.
Wasn't that Mick the justification for Afghanistan, the justification for Iraq, the justification for Libya?
Totally. And this is the thing. These snowflake globalist fanatics, Majid Nawaz and all the lot of them, O'Brien, a lot of them, they are deeply, deeply racist.
Are you talking,
people.
Nick, are you talking about my fellow presenters on LBC?
I'm saying that they come across as being for the poor. They are deeply colonialist, racist people who are
that's a bit strong.
Globalism. In my opinion, that's what they are.
Well, no, Mick, we all have our opinions. And, of course, and I have to tell you, Mick, the great thing about LBC is that they do have a range of presenters with all of those different opinions. I think it's what makes the radio station actually what it is. And whichever your point of view, you can listen in the morning to James O'Brien and love him and hate me in the evening, or vice versa. And kind of a lot of people do that, it seems to me. I'm going to ask Tony in Epsom what he thinks the Prime Minister should say or do next.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well. I just, I think she was right to adopt a firm tone.
I agree with Jeremy Corbyn as well.
But he's saying, basically, Tony, Jeremy Corbyn today was standing up in many ways for what we would call British values. Namely,
common sense as well. Common sense. I think that the two of them just need to get together, because at the end of the day, if we go to war, it's not going to be them two dying. It's going to be our kids. So why can't the two of them just sort it out, get together? Because if Russia are involved, then they need to sit down together and sort it out, eye to eye. And if Russia isn't involved, then someone's trying to stitch them up. So then they've got mutual interest. Then they need to sit down eye to eye and sort it out. I think that's got to happen. I think before it just gets so out of hand.
Tony, I think whatever your view, whether you think we've provoked Russia over the Ukraine and this has led to so much of what's come back, whether you think Putin's evil, and is definitely did this, whatever we think, I really believe the act of true leadership from our Prime Minister would be to say, I want a meeting with Putin and to fly to Moscow to see him, to thrash out this and many other areas. Tony, I thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, live from here in Strasbourg. It's now 7:30. Prime Minister May tells the House of Commons it's probably Russia what done it in terms of the poisoning in Salisbury. Jeremy Corbyn urges caution and says dialogue must remain open. But before I get back to that, a story broke in the Sunday Mirror yesterday that I think is, should be, a huge story in this country. We've heard the story before, but in some ways this one I think is even more horrific than anything that preceded it in Rotherham or Rochdale or Oxford or anywhere else. Yes, it's the Telford story that the Sunday Mirror broke yesterday, saying that up to 1,000 children could have suffered in Britain's worst ever abuse scandal, where gangs were targeting girls as young as 11. The really shocking thing about it is that apparently this has now been going on for 40 years, which is quite extraordinary. Some quite big accusations that the Mirror make, such as the police failed to investigate one recent case 5 times until a Member of Parliament actually intervened. So there's talk of cover-ups. Once again, it's the same story. It is predominantly, and I haven't got the percentages, but if you listen to Majid Nawaz on LBC, he will tell you that of gang underage sexual grooming, 87% was the figure he used yesterday, come from somewhere in South Asia and come from the Muslim religion. And yet, what is extraordinary about this horrendous story, which, by the way, includes murder as well, one particular girl who threatened to blow the whistle and her house was burnt down and she, her mother and sister were killed. It is an horrendous story. And yet, you know something? Earlier on today, the BBC homepage had no mention of Telford on it at all. Later on, it did appear, but below a story about the dog show at Crufts. I mean, anyone would think that the establishment don't want us to have an open debate on this. And linked to that, and this is interesting, there's an organisation called Generation Identity. Now, some would say that they are extremely Islamophobic. Others would say they're exercising their rights to free speech in criticising aspects of that religion. But interestingly, 3 people, 1 Austrian, 2 Americans, have been, 2 have been arrested, one's been deported, another was stopped at Calais from coming into the country, where Schedule 7 of the Prevention of Terrorism Act was cited. Now, whether you like these people or approve of the tactics they use, and remember, Generation Identity put a banner on Westminster Bridge, which offended some people, and its criticism of Islam, I do ask a question. You know, what price free speech? And the timing of this is extraordinary, because these people were arrested or prevented from coming in literally a day before this Telford story broke. All right, I do understand the government's perspective that you certainly wouldn't want people in this country who were going to incite violence, who were part of any terrorist network, but to see Schedule 7 used against an activist who criticises a religion, and for that to be condemned as now being racism, and all of this in a country that allowed back in 400 people who'd been fighting with ISIS in Syria. I do wonder whether we're perhaps getting our priorities right, or maybe we're getting them wrong on this. You know, I don't want hate preachers on either side of this divide, but I do think in a free society we should be allowed to criticise each other, our lifestyles, our religions, without being banned from doing so. I really hope that this Telford story gets bigger over the course of the next few days, and we start to have an open, honest debate about the appalling things that have happened in this country. Because the reason no one wants to talk about it is the fact is it is the fault of successive governments in this country that have allowed this to happen, and that's the debate they don't want. Back to Russia, back to Salisbury, back to May's tough words. What should she do next? Charlie says, Putin is correct, we are weak. Alison says, if they trace the nerve agent back to the only factory in Russia that produces it, along with the fact that Putin is the only one that can sanction this kind of mission, then okay, it's Russia. But the thing is, even then, what do we do about it? Sanctions and posturing is not the way to go. Don't poke the bear. I hear they like honey. Well, I've often said, Alison, don't poke the Russian bear. But if it's proved that it is them, then she's got to be pretty tough. I'm convinced, folks, the one real act of leadership that is needed right here, and it's not just this issue, is it? We've got other problems with Russia at the moment. We're kind of back almost to the Cold War. I think she needs to demand a meeting with him. That's my view. Leonard says, we should have been speaking to Russia already, but the damage the politicians and media have done makes it very awkward. Dennis says, can everyone stop pointing the finger at Russia? We have this stuff here in the UK, in Wiltshire. We do, Dennis. It's in somewhere called Porton Down, and the Porton Down establishment is about 4 miles, as the crow flies, from the centre of Salisbury. So Dennis saying, was it stolen from there? We don't yet know the truth. Thomas is calling from Worthing. Good evening, Thomas.
Good evening. Also, don't poke the lion with a stick either. I think I hate conspiracy theories. I really do. But, I mean, we've got the development of European army. We've got the potential for another bordering nation to Russia joining the EU. So, I mean, I think the way it is, I mean, everybody in terms of the public will have their opinions on this. The people behind the scenes will have more detailed information, both in this country and elsewhere. I think that Vladimir Putin occasionally sends out a message to, leaders, national authorities, to remind them that Russia is still a massive power and they have the ability to inflict damage. Now, I think Thomas,
but Thomas, hang on. Mm-hmm. If part of that was the eradication of people they see as traitors, I might follow you. But what has happened here in Salisbury has threatened ordinary civilians as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's also a timely reminder from Vladimir Putin's point of view to other Russian nationals who might be working in spy circles, security, whatever, that, their lives will never be the same again if they decide to opt out to the other side.
Yes.
I think there's not an element there. Just to respond to what happened in Parliament earlier, this is one of the rare occasions, possibly the first occasion, where I actually agree with Theresa May.
Wow.
The reason I disagree fundamentally with what Corbyn did, I might disagree with the background of what he was saying, but the point is that he took the opportunity where, bearing in mind there are still 3 people seriously ill in hospital, to score political points off of the Conservatives about something that isn't necessarily.
Do you really think he did, Thomas? Do you really think he did?
I really think he did, and I think it's absolutely disgraceful. And again, one of these rare occasions where I agree with somebody that I nearly always disagree with. I thought Yvette Cooper was absolutely spot on in her response. The Parliament needs to be united in this instance. This is a very serious issue. In any other circumstance, we would be referring to this as A, terrorist attack, and B, the deployment of a weapon of mass destruction.
Well, Thomas, absolutely. I mean, if this could be pinned on an Islamic group or a far-right group, we would be calling it terrorism, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. And why aren't we using that language now? I mean,
we're not.
Russia is a massive threat to Europe and the world, and Vladimir Putin is going to want to remind people of that fact. And, we need to start having a debate about what we can do. I mean, from my point of view, I think we need to start kicking out diplomats. I think we also need to withdraw from the World Cup and encourage other nations to do the same.
Thomas, can you imagine? Can you imagine, Thomas, if you right now were to put down the phone, go into the busiest pub in Worthing and say, hang on, lads, quiet for a moment, please. Who will support my idea that we're going to withdraw England from the World Cup? What kind of response do you reckon you'd get?
I think I would put it maybe slightly differently. I'd say what's more important, a football match or protecting UK nationals from possible weapon of mass destruction. And I agree with what's been said before, weapons of mass destruction, 30 minutes, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is it has happened on UK soil, so there is evidence.
All right, so the answer is, Thomas, then from you, keep tough, Prime Minister, keep going.
Absolutely.
All right, smashing. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas, for your point of view. There are some very, very strong passions in all of this. David says Russia will not get punished, and that's kind of really my view on all of this. Alice says, what's May going to do tomorrow night? This is after the deadline has passed. If Putin doesn't reply, block his number, double text him, what? Alice, I'm pleased someone out there is seeing the light side of this. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 7:45. Prime Minister May was pretty tough today in the House of Commons, saying she thinks it probably is Russia behind that horrible poisoning that has taken place in Salisbury. And the Russians have got a deadline. They've got to tell us by 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon what's going on. Corbyn is urging caution and saying whatever we do, we've got to keep talking. My view is she needs a meeting with Putin. That's certainly my view. But before I get back to that, I want to tell you about my brand new podcast called Farage Against the Machine. I've spent over 20 years taking on the establishment, and that's what this podcast is all about. My first episode went live on Friday, where I take you backstage at CPAC, the big conference in America I was at the other week, and I interview the chair of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, about the conference, its success, and his personal relationship with President Trump. Go to lbc.co.uk to find out how to get involved by either using Apple or Android phones, and I want you to subscribe. We're going to have a whole load, I think, of really interesting interviews and lots of behind-the-scenes stuff that normally you wouldn't ever get a chance to hear. Pat says the EU are running rings around Mrs. May. She has no chance with Putin if he was responsible. Well, Pat, a lot of people were saying yesterday we want Mrs. May to be more like Donald Trump, to stand up for the national interest, to stand up to bullies. And she perhaps tonight, as she has her dinner, will think, well, do you know what? In a way, I kind of did stand up. Trouble is, Pat, has she done it before we actually have the evidence? Has she been pushed into it a little prematurely? One thing I can tell you is she will be in Brussels on the 22nd of this month, where she'll be there with the leaders of the other 27 countries, the big cheeses, the big unelected bosses in Brussels like Barnier and Juncker, and they'll be talking there about the transition period, and a lot of people want her to stand up pretty strongly there for the national interest. But back to her speech today, what should she say or do next, if anything? Jonty is calling from St John's Wood. Jonty, good evening.
Nigel, what are you saying?
I'm asking you a question. What should she do next? I think she should demand a meeting with him.
You are normally full of common sense, but the idea, you nearly made me fall off my chair. The idea of her asking for a meeting in Moscow, you call her Theresa the Appeaser, it's Nigel the Appeaser. That's ridiculous.
Oh, right. So, Jonty, would you apply that same logic to the proposed talks between the North Korean leader and the American leader?
Yes, because Trump has been strong, and then he's got a meeting. We haven't been strong yet. Firstly, we got to show our teeth, and then we call a meeting. We don't run off to Moscow like Chamberlain in 1938 and scuttle to Putin at the Kremlin.
Well, I tell you what, ask him to come here then.
He can come here, or we can meet him in Reykjavik, but don't go off to Moscow.
Fine, okay. No, I accept that point, Jonty. What I was saying was, she actually today was a bit stronger, I think, that we've seen her of recent times. There was a certain resolution in the way in which she delivered that speech today. Now, I do accept...
I was surprised by one thing. If I was in her position, I would have got Trump and other leaders on my side first. I feel as a citizen of Britain, I feel that we're hanging in the wind. We're on our own. We need to have our allies rallied first.
Well,
and then sound strong.
Jonty, I think you could argue that the opportunity and the possibility for a big relationship with Donald Trump was there. It was offered. It was on the table, and we've kind of rejected that a bit in the last year, haven't we?
I agree. We should be hugging the Trump. Absolutely.
So we're hugging the Trump. Yeah, I tell you what, he's got a pretty strong hug, Jonty. She'd have to be careful. He's quite a big bear himself, you know. Sorry, Jonty, go on.
A bit of a reputation, but she's probably too old. But anyhow, listen,
I didn't hear that.
I want to give you a tip on Brexit. Okay, you know you go on about 10% tariffs, flowers. By the time you've done the markup, it's 20%. If you do the math, it's worse than what you're saying, because the supermarkets have to double the import prices. So these tariffs, which go up to about 35% for the biggest one, add up to 70% on our retail costs. It's outrageous.
Well, Jonty, what I've always done, all through my time in politics and now doing this job with LBC and elsewhere, is I always understate the case. And when they criticise me for being outrageous, then go further. Jonty, I thank you. Jonty pointing out your Mother's Day flowers yesterday were even more expensive than I told you yesterday morning. Joseph is calling from Sheffield. Good evening, Joseph.
Hi, Nigel. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. So what do you think Mrs May should do after her tough words today?
I think we should be more respectful of the Russians. Russia is a serious big state, and we cannot be treating it like a kangaroo banana state. If we treat Russia with respect, we are far more likely to elicit or to get a change of behavior from the Kremlin than shouting from the rooftop and all this anti-Russia, Russophobic nonsense coming out from the parliament. Secondly, if anybody listened to Jack Straw yesterday on Sunday Politics, he was brutally honest. We mismanaged the relationship with Russia. He said we should think about it this way, like United Kingdom, losing Scotland, losing Northern Ireland, losing northwest of England, losing the northeast of England, and losing the Midland. That was the kind of position we put Russia when we were like getting Ukraine and like and European countries. And no country, no serious country is going to sit comfortably or is going to be like take everything calmly if you're like poking them that way. So I think we need to treat Russia with respect. I agree with you. Theresa May or whoever our leader is need to see eyeball to Mr. Putin and say, can we like reset relationship? And the last caller is talking bollocks. We've been on this part for about many years. Where has it gotten us? So you cannot
Joseph, I do take your point. We have provoked Russia. That wasn't a clever thing to do. But that of itself doesn't justify all of Russian actions. Certainly things that happen within the country with disappearing journalists, etc., which are not very pretty, Joseph, are they?
It's not very pretty. And can I just add, I'm very, very skeptical and dubious of the deep state United Kingdom intelligence service that drove us to Libya, told us there were 70,000 noble, kind and gentle free Syrian army guys to join us if we went to war in Syria, that drove us to Iraq. I'm very dubious and skeptical of what we're hearing from Mrs. May via our secret intelligence state. So I think we should be very skeptical about it. Even if it's found that Russia did it, it's better we sit down with them and say, well, what do you want
really, Joseph, you're backing up Corbyn today, who said whatever the circumstances turn out to be, dialogue must continue. Joseph, I thank you, and some of you may have heard Joseph there getting a little bit too passionate and perhaps using a word that was a bit colourful before the watershed, so I do apologise to any younger ears that heard that. Karen says, Putin is extremely strong, unbelievably rich, but someone not to be trusted. Well, Karen, fine, but where does that take us? Gina says we need dialogue with Russia. Quite a lot of people, I sense, thinking that Jeremy Corbyn struck a note today that perhaps rather surprised everybody. Matthew's in Leicester. Good evening, Matthew.
Good evening, Nigel. So, really what I want to try and get across is the point from where the Prime Minister actually really is.
Yep.
Which is, it's all very well and good her standing up in Parliament and saying, well, we're going to be very strong and we're going to be very tough. But convention dictates that she can only do what is called a proportionate response. Now, a proportionate response, if you think about it, needs to be within proportion to whatever they have done to you. Now, if she was to do a very similar sort of thing, that would mean that we are going to be hurting people over in Russia. We can't do that, purely just because of the Geneva Convention. So, realistically, she's in a very, very weak position, because if she does not give a proportionate response, then Russia are going to think, well, we can do whatever we want. And if she just goes and tries talking to them, again, Russia are going to think we can do whatever we want. If she then tries to give a proportionate response, whether that be expelling diplomats, well, that's not quite proportionate. So realistically, if she wants to show strength, she has to do something very uncharacteristic and something which, quite frankly, we don't want to do. But let's not forget, Russia have been baiting the government for many, many years. They send fleets of ships through the English Channel.
And airspace.
And airspace.
Yeah. But would I be right, Matthew? Would I be right, Matthew, in saying that the return of those Cold War tactics have all come since the crisis over the Ukraine?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
So we haven't helped ourselves. We haven't helped ourselves. Matthew, I'm out of time. I thank you. I'm sorry to Dave in Carlisle and all the others that wanted to come on. Piece of breaking news relevant to what we discussed a few minutes ago from the White House. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press spokeswoman, has said that she's offered America's support to Britain over Russia. So the point that was made earlier, that we need friends out there, again and again and again, whether you like him or whether you loathe him, Trump actually wants to be besties with us. So don't look a gift horse in the mouth. It's not a very clever thing to do. Tough from the Prime Minister today. I think she needs to have a meeting with Putin. I accept the criticism of me when I mentioned Moscow. She shouldn't go there. It should be somewhere neutral like Oslo. But these talks, it seems to me, need to happen. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. At 10 this evening, it's Ian Collins. But up next, it's Beverly Turner.
Good evening. Thank you, Nigel.